What's up, guys?
Hey, everybody.
What up?
How are you guys doing?
Listen, what
Oh,
up?
God. We'll all just start talking at the same time? That's cool. All right.
Yeah. I just gotta say hello. I know I
Hello.
look a little, I know I look a little bit different. I know it's been a while. And I know I look good, and I just hope you enjoy. Shabbat shalom.
Yes,
Do
Oscar.
you
We
want to?
did notice there's less of you. Thank you.
Your screen's a bit dark,
Congrats.
but we'll
Congrats.
try to notice.
I'm talking about my hair, but yes, there is less of me.
That's right.
Man.
Cool.
Oh, are we all going to do the finger guns?
Yeah, man.
Everyone do
Yeah.
finger guns. Johnny, do
Perfect.
finger guns.
That's for the thumbnail of the video. Just all of us doing finger guns.
It's just finger guns.
But yeah, we
So
we don't have everybody here, but we got us four, so we're
we
gonna
got enough. It's fine.
we'll be fine. We're gonna
We'll deal. We'll deal.
so we're just gonna cover. We're gonna do a two-part video. So the first part we're gonna cover the two houses and more the
Mhm.
historical thing, and then in the second part we go into how it ties into Yeshua and why he came and what it means, for the future.
Right. Exactly.
But I very very brief summary of the two houses for people that
Mhm.
don't know. Basically, Israel got divided. We became the house of Judah, the house of Israel. One got dispersed, and they were scattered amongst the nations. That's basically what the two house thing is. But I guess the big important question is, why is it important? I think one of the main things that why is it important is because there's a big thing in Christianity called replacement theology.
Mhm.
And what that is like Israel is done away with. God doesn't want to do anything with Israel, and now the new Israel is the church. And God doesn't care about the Jews; it's just about the Christians now.
Right.
And once you start looking into the two houses and how it works and what's the prophecies regarding the two houses, you see that the replacement theology doesn't really fit, and that's why it's important to study those things. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Knowing how the idea of two house has been misconstrued through, or misunderstanding the text, or kind of twisting the meaning of certain things, really lends credence to understanding how the replacement theology isn't the best idea, since we're not meant to be divided. We're not meant to replace anything. We're not meant to cut anybody off or make anyone irrelevant. That's not the point of the Torah. So to understand two houses, to really understand what the full idea of Torah, and that's bringing everyone together in the name of Yah. So
Yeah, and I think when you look also into the two houses, it also explains the rest of the half of the Bible.
Mhm.
Because if you don't know about it, the New Testament doesn't make as much sense, and why exactly Yeshua is coming, and what's the whole point of him coming in the
Exactly.
first place.
Yeah, it's a big issue of the New Testament and a lot of the prophets, and so understanding that will understand why, and not so much what the letters mean, but why they're writing them in the first place.
Exactly, like why are they going? Sorry.
And like without the concept of the two houses, yeah, you can take the New Testament as its own thing. But I think that that concept of the two houses, what it does, it unifies the Old Testament with the New Testament in a very serious way, and it just helps it, like it just unifies the ideas, right? Because like we're used to like saying New Testament, Old Testament, two very different things, right? One was before Yeshua, one is after Yeshua, and the concepts changed,
Exactly.
the law changed, everything. But when you see the two houses in that process, everything starts to unify. And
Connects.
like, oh, that's
Exactly.
why this is happening. That's why Yeshua does this. That's why. Oh, it's all connected. It's not meant to be separate. It's meant to be one whole thing.
Yeah, because when I was in Christian church, that's how it was. Once you get to the last book of the Old Testament, that's it. And then the New Testament is just like a whole separate story. So they're like two separate stories that don't connect. But like you
Right,
said,
exactly.
the two houses is like that bridge, and it makes like one long continuous story, and it makes sense. And you see like this whole loop.
Yeah. Also, more to the point. I was actually studying this topic earlier today with my father, and we drew a lot of parallels between even the Torah portion itself and the things that went over, the curses and what happens when you disobey. And we're reading Jeremiah, I think 2-11, and just seeing the same parallels and the same kind of repercussions to the same issues, and seeing a lot more tied together between those two chapters. And so when you see that, you understand that it's the same ideas permeating through all the books, It's just a different setting, a different time, different people, but it's the same problems in cycles, kind of reiterating.
Yeah. So, like I said, we're gonna go into the history of how everything started, so that way you can understand, and then later on we'll go into like the other topics in the New Testament, how it connects to the Old Testament.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
So
I'm okay.
So where we start is, like how exactly were the houses divided? What happened? What caused it? And if you go back to 1 Kings 11:29 to 39, I think I have it. Let me
Let's see. First Kings. Some quality content. Just sitting here in silence, just looking at verses.
I had it on my phone and it reloaded.
Oh, the follies of technology. First Kings 11:29 to 39.
Yeah.
Looks like.
I will keep speaking until you find it. Here I am speaking.
There you go. Oh, it's always a good sign when the very title of the passage is Solomon turns from God. That's always a good start.
It's a great start. But here, do you want to read it?
Sure. To 39, correct?
Yes, to 39.
29 to 39. I can do this. So much pressure. Here we go. And it came about at that time when Jeroboam left Jerusalem that the prophet Ahijah and the Shilonite met him on the road. Now, Ahijah had covered himself with a new cloak, and the two of them were alone in the field. And then, there we go. Then Ahijah took hold of the new cloak which he was wearing and tore it into 12 pieces. He said to Jeroboam, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for thus says the Lord." This is very important, since that only happens with prophets. "For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, behold, I am going to tear the kingdom from the hand of Solomon and give you 10 tribes. But he and his descendants shall have one tribe." Benjamin was annexed to Judah. "For the sake of my servant David, and for the sake of Jerusalem, the city which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, because they have abandoned me and worshipped Ashtoreth and the goddess of the Sidonians." Was it Chemosh?
Yeah,
Chemosh, the god of the Moabites, Milcom, the god of the sons of Ammon, and they have not walked in my ways and followed my commandments, doing what is right in my sight and keeping my statutes and my ordinances, as did his father David. However, I will not take the entire kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose because he kept my commandments and my statutes. But I will take the kingdom out of his hands and give it to you. 10 tribes, yet to his son I will give one tribe, so that my servant David may have a lamp always before me in Jerusalem, the city where I have chosen to put my name and presence. I will take you, Jeroboam, and you shall reign over whatever your soul desires, and you shall be king over Israel, the 10 northern tribes. Then it shall be that if you listen to all that I command you, and walk in my ways, and do what is right in my sight, keeping and observing my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you and build you an enduring house, as I built for David, and I will give you Israel. I'll give Israel to you. Real quick, I just want to mention, I'm reading the Amplified version, I believe.
Yeah.
That's what this is. The Amplified Bible, and it makes a clear statement, which is something very important, and it may be the root cause of a lot of these issues, but it says, in verse 37 at the very end, "And you shall be king over Israel." And it makes sure to specify the 10 northern tribes, because Israel is a very blanket statement, like Ephraim. People refer to Ephraim and they blanket all of Israel or all the 10 tribes, because it could mean those things, right? Israel could mean everybody or just the 10 tribes.
Exactly.
Ephraim could mean just the tribe of Ephraim or the northern kingdom. And because they usually don't specify in these letters in the apostles, because they know the context, the audience knows already, but we don't. That's how the replacement theology even comes about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So you got to the 39, right? I read that,
Yeah.
right? Okay, yeah. So I mean, like we saw in those verses, Solomon, he started taking all these women, these concubines, and along with them, he took a bunch of idols, and that was the beginning of the turning away.
Mm-hmm.
You have something to say, Oscar?
Yeah, yeah. I wanted to kind of dive into that part that you're talking about right now. It's kind of the because I feel the verses that we read are the event or moment where it was divided, but not the cost
Mm-hmm.
itself, right? And there was a lot of things, right? Because Solomon, when we think of him, we think of the wisest man. We think of, he built up the temple that his father did not build.
Mm-hmm.
God said, your son will build it, not you. He builds it. And then God opens up the heavens, looks upon him, and says, what do you want from me? Like, well, what do you want? I mean, not in that way, but like, I'll give it to you. Anything you ask, I'll give it to you right now. If you ask it. Solomon asks for wisdom.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And God says, nice. Like you could have asked for anything else, but you asked for wisdom to run a kingdom. Here you go, dude. Here you go, man. Like, run the kingdom as you need to run it. Here's the wisdom that you need for it. And a lot of people are like, how does the wisest man, push a kingdom towards this moment that we see that Rico just read? And it's the moment where God is like, he messed up pretty bad, guys.
Mm-hmm.
He's like to all the angels, he messed up. He's like, geez, we gotta divide it. All right. And he divides it. And he gives 10 tribes to a servant, to a servant. And he only gives one tribe in quotation marks, because when you think about it, it's like, wait, there's 12 tribes,
Mm-hmm.
only one. It's Judah and Benjamin. It's they just combined into one. Benjamin was inside the territory of Judah, so it's like, all right, it's one tribe. It's just one.
Yeah.
All right, it's whatever.
Yeah, whatever. Just take the whole thing. Yeah.
Just take it. Just take it. All right. But when you think about it, it's what Solomon used his wisdom for. Wisdom isn't necessarily finding the perfect way for every single situation. It's just being understanding, like understanding the situation, understanding what you want, and finding the best way to achieve what you want.
Mm-hmm.
That's wise. I mean, and when you say, oh, he was wise, yeah, and he wanted to grow the kingdom,
Mm-hmm.
and he did. Israel was at that moment, according to the scholars, according to the writings, at Solomon's reign, it was the richest it had been.
Mm-hmm.
It had the best relationships it had with all the other nations. Yeah, he was wise.
I mean,
he made great political decisions.
The first temple was one of the ancient wonders of the world. That was
Yeah.
one of the big 8.
Yeah.
So
like he was wise. He made relationships with Egypt. He made relationships with all the nations around him. And
Yeah.
suddenly you're like, yeah, he's super wise because he's making Israel better. He did.
Mm-hmm.
But then he neglected a certain aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
And what aspect was it? Because having relation. By the way, there's a verse in the Torah that says kings shouldn't have multiple wives, like too many wives, and
Yeah.
kings shouldn't have too
Yeah.
many horses. And
Yeah, it
we
does
can
say that.
debate what that necessarily means, but Solomon wanted to build a great kingdom, so he's like, all right, I'm just gonna start marrying all the daughters of great kings and just start making great relationships.
Yeah,
and he just started doing that. Suddenly he had like 300 wives and 700 concubines, and you're like, are you taking it a little far?
Way again.
Yeah, it's just an example of him falling into that political system,
Yeah.
which is sad.
And he rode that political system great.
Mm-hmm.
Because he got what he wanted out of the political system, right? But he neglected the religious aspect of what God wanted. Is, hey, I'm the only God, and he got so many wives. He's like, yeah, worship whatever God you want. But suddenly you have a queen who is worshiping Astra, or worshiping a god of Egypt, or worshiping a god of whatever nation that we're at the moment, and suddenly the people are like, okay, so we can worship that god, right? Right? They just build a monument on that hill so we can go worship that, right?
Right.
And people started worshiping, and God's like, hey, buddy, what happened to Yud Hey Vav Hey is one.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what happened to that? Like, I am the only God, no other. I'm the one who took you out of Egypt. no other. And suddenly all Israelites were like, yo, we got 300 gods. Sweet, buddy.
Right.
Yeah, awesome. And that kind of
Oh, froze.
slowly
There we go.
but surely drove them into, just sin. Little, because when your leader is walking towards sin, everyone,
Follows, yeah.
sometimes, not everyone,
Most
but
of the
like
time.
everyone who's a follower, all the people who are sheeple, they just like go, they just go and follow, right? And you got the prophets who are like, "What are you doing, Solomon? Dude, what are you doing?"
Just like
And
that.
then you have everybody else who's like, "Yeah, the king is doing it. The king is
Mhm.
wise. He's getting riches. That means it's okay. Let's go do it." And God's like, "Nah, man, you're using your wisdom incorrectly, bro, and that has consequences, right?" And that led to everything that we're seeing in that text, where a servant of Solomon who held close to God, who was a good servant, God is like, "You're a good servant. You know what? I'm gonna give you 80% of the kingdom, 85% of the kingdom. You're gonna be the one ruling, and I'm gonna take it away from him. But because of the promise I did to his father, what promise? You ask.
Mhm.
He
What
said that
promise?
the lineage of David was gonna be reigning in Israel forever.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
So he can't go back on what he promised David.
exactly.
So he's like,
Right.
okay, I'm not gonna go against that. I'm gonna keep a certain portion of the kingdom. What portion? Judah, Benjamin, and a portion of the Simeon tribe. I'm gonna keep them there. That's gonna be part of Solomon's kingdom and his descendants. But everything else is gonna be part of your descendants. And suddenly there was this civil unrest, like we're seeing today. Like, let's not hide the things that we're seeing today in the United States or the world in general. Everybody's on civil unrest. Everyone
Mhm.
wants to go against each other. So just imagine that situation's boiling up. Keep boiling. Keep boiling. Points are different. And suddenly there was a divide. And God
Mhm.
said, yeah, this is what I demanded because of your sin. Whose sin? Solomon's. And as that verse said, he went after different gods because of that reason.
Yeah, but then the problem is that like God told Jeroboam, like if you follow me, I'll be on your side. But he did not do that exactly. If you keep reading, I think it's the next chapter.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's
I was gonna,
26 to 33.
yeah. I was gonna actually mention that specifically that we see that going to what Oscar was saying, where he was talking about all the influence that the people were getting from King Solomon and from the other nations that King Solomon was assimilating himself to. Then we see how easy it was with Jeroboam, right after in chapter 12, First Kings, after verse from verse like 25 on, talks about how they start setting up high places in different
Mhm.
locations, and then they try to assimilate and copy what their form of worship was in Jerusalem in the temple to their own imagination, using pagan stuff.
Yeah.
So you
Well,
just see how deep assimilation can really get to.
the, the
Yeah, and it's not that Jeroboam wanted to go against God per se.
why don't we read the verse
It's
though?
all right. Let's go.
No,
Let's
let's
go
do it.
for it.
Let's read the verse.
Who wants to read?
I got it.
All right,
Uh,
do it. Do it, Johnny.
Let me see. So it says, okay, and Jeroboam said in his heart, now the kingdom may return to the house of David. If these people go up to offer sacrifice in the house of the Lord at Jerusalem, then the heart of this people will turn back to the Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah, and they will kill me and go back to Rehoboam, king of Judah. Therefore the king asked advice, made 2 calves of gold, and said to the people, it is too much for you to go up to Jerusalem. Here are your gods, O Israel, which you brought up from the land of Egypt. And he set up one in Bethel, and the other he put in Dan. Now this thing became a sin for the people who went to worship before the one as far as Dan. He made shrines in high places and made priests from every class of people who were not of the sons of Levi. Jeroboam ordained a feast on the 15th day of the 8th month, like the feast that was in Judah, and offered sacrifices on the altar. So he did it at Bethel, sacrificing to the calves that he had made, and at Bethel he installed the priests of the high places which he had made. So he made offerings on the altar which he had made at Bethel on the 15th day of the 8th month, in the month which he had devised in his own heart. He ordained a feast for the children of Israel and offered sacrifices on the altar and burned incense. So, like,
Okay.
for me, in my opinion, like, this is just my opinion. I think he did something either equally or worse than Solomon, because instead of going in a good direction, he kind of tried to replace the temple of God.
Yeah, this is just real quick, because there's a few things to unpack in this whole thing. And Johnny, you're definitely right. It's a lot. The best way you could phrase this whole passage is he did not stay in his lane, and he immediately started swerving around the road, setting up idols, declaring that these are the gods of Israel, setting up high places. So anyone who doesn't know, high places at that time was the same as like a temple, a holy mountain, getting as close to God as you can. So when they would build temples on high places on hills, it was an affront. So if the king setting up multiple temples, multiple gods everywhere, and saying these are your gods now, and probably the biggest offense I've seen is that he was it in the month which he had devised in his own heart. So he decided to make his own holiday for his own gods in the land of Israel.
His own altar with this like desire, how he wanted to build it, and according to the book of Leviticus and how it was supposed to be built.
Don't do this.
All right, so there's some. I'm a follow me. All right, I'm gonna take you on a little trip. Follow me.
All right, here we go.
David committed multiple sins as well. Did he not?
Right.
He did. He made a couple mistakes. He made one or two, whatever.
Two big ones.
Yeah, small things.
Just like the adultery, killing a good servant. But most of the time David was king, he didn't have the ark with him. Like the ark came into his kingdom, but there was a portion where the ark wasn't there.
Yeah.
Like there came a moment where he brought it back. And there's a verse in the Tanakh where it says, in the Torah specifically, where it says that the king has to write the Torah.
Right.
Like you have to write the Torah to remember. Like because if you're the king, this is the law that you have to uphold. So write it down so you can remember it. Right?
Exactly.
Suddenly you have this new king who does not have the Ark of Covenant because he's not in Judah, which the Ark of Covenant was there. So he suddenly separates and he commits the same sin that Solomon does because he tries to be wise of how to maintain his kingdom without consulting God. Because Solomon wanted to be wise on how to build his kingdom, so he just went and reached out to other nations. Mm-hmm. And now you have Jeroboam who wants to keep his kingdom strong, and he says, you know what? It's not smart for my kingdom to go to your kingdom every year and give you tribute every year. That doesn't make sense. Like, why is my kingdom gonna go to you? Like, when you think about it wisely, not thinking God into consideration, hey, yeah, it's smart for you to be like, don't go to that place because that's not our kingdom. You're gonna give money to people who aren't ours, who aren't you. It's just a smart, wise thing to do. But the thing is, there's a rule and there's a structure that you have to follow. Mm-hmm. And you suddenly see Jeroboam being afraid of his kingdom. He's like, I don't want my kingdom to downfall. I don't want my people to return to Judah because God gave this to me. And he became so scared for keeping his own kingdom and keeping what he wanted that God gave him that he started to kind of disalign himself with God, just like Solomon did with wanting to keep God's kingdom in glory, right? So he starts pushing away, and suddenly there's this, as my brother just said, it's like suddenly you're building a temple in high places because it's not like he wanted to worship other gods. Those idols weren't meant to represent a god like Astaroth, like Solomon built. They weren't meant to represent other gods. They were meant to represent Yah, just like the Israelites did with Moses. They built, when Moses was in the mountain for 40 days and he wasn't coming down, they got scared and they were like, oh geez, this boy isn't coming down. We don't have a leader. Let's build a calf in representation of Moses. And they did the exact same thing. They built calves because they were afraid of losing the structure that God had given. And they shouldn't have been afraid because God gave it to him. Mm-hmm. But he did. He feared. And in his wisdom and his understanding, he made a decision to build temples outside of Jerusalem, to change the feast dates, to change the place, to change the Levites. not because he wanted to disobey God. It's not like his intent was, hey, I want to walk away from God. I want to make no. He was, God gave me this. I want to make sure to keep it. But the thing is, he didn't think of how God wants me to keep it. He was in his own wisdom, in his own thought process. How can I keep this in desperation? How can I keep this? How do I make sure that this doesn't go back to Judah? And he made a lot of mistakes.
Right.
And that led to what we're going to talk about in a couple minutes as I pass it off to Johnny.
That kind of, you know, what he did kind of sets up what happens with Israel, because as you keep reading on, Israel has a big problem with idolatry, and it's mostly because of Jeroboam. You know, he started a bad habit, sort of say, in Israel to start doing idol worship, going to high places, having a priesthood that has nothing to do with the Levites and stuff like that. So what he did was a very, you know, a grave sin. I think that's the word.
Yeah. It was basically treason.
Yeah. Like even this day in archaeology in Israel, you go and there's many places and many communities that are known to be Jewish communities, and they found many idols.
I know there's like they still have like Molechs and stuff like that, right? Like little.
And I think this clarification might be unnecessary. But to make sure that you guys understand, the idols at the moment of Jeroboam weren't meant to represent other gods. Like, they were meant to represent God. But the thing is, even if you're trying to do something for God, if you go against what God told you to do, it's an idol. Like, even if you're like, hey, I'm representing the God of Israel, so I want to make a statue for him right here, right now. I want to build a statue for the God of Israel because I love him. Hey, bring me a calf because we're going to sacrifice a lamb for the God of Israel. Make sure it's perfect. Make sure it has no defects. Let's do it right here, right now. I'm making an idol,
right?
Even though I want to do it for God, even if I want to do it for the one true God of Israel, the one who is the God of the armies, the God of all power, the Creator, the most wonderful, merciful, just Lord that there is and ever will exist.
Well, I think the problem is that wasn't really Jeroboam's intentions. He was really worried about, like you said, losing the kingdom that was given to him. It wasn't his in the first place. And on top of that, he had a very selfish idea that, if they keep going back to Jerusalem, they might reunite and the kingdom will be back together again. And I don't want that to happen, which is kind of it's messed up, yeah.
But it doesn't matter because, for example, Israel did the same thing in the desert, right? Their mentality was it wasn't a bad mentality, right? It was, hey, Moses isn't here. Who's gonna represent God? Because when God spoke to them and giving the 10 Commandments, what did they say? They said, hey, I know that he's holy. I know that he's strong. I know that he's righteous. We're not ready to talk to him. Go before us and lead us. And whatever he says to you, we'll keep. Right? Moses went up there for 40 days. He didn't come back before the 40 days. They got scared and they were like, Moses probably died because he's so righteous and he's so powerful that Moses probably couldn't carry that weight. And he died. All right, so let's just build a statue that represents Moses and that leads us and speaks to God just like Moses did. Like, their intent wasn't evil. They wanted to follow God. So I don't want to put into Jeroboam.
Here's the thing. I don't fully agree with that, because even at the end of the chapter, it really seems like Jeroboam, like his fear and his anxiety kind of twist him in a way where now, even here you can see in verse 28, so the king took counsel and made 2 calves of gold, and he said to the people, it is too much for you to go all the way up to Jerusalem. Behold, your gods, O Israel, he's pointing at the calves, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. So it's in this verse, he's trying to supplant these 2 golden calves for Adonai.
I don't want to go into a debate, but you said it yourself. He sought counsel, right? So he was like, hey, guys, what do you think we should do, right? And there's a proverb that says that in the multitude of counsel, there is wisdom. Right, so I just don't want to attribute to him that he desired to go against God's will. I just
look out of wisdom or not, he still declared these 2 calves are that God.
So just like Solomon did, right? So Solomon, he was wise. And Jeroboam also sought wisdom, and maybe the wisdom that they sought just wasn't necessarily the perfect wisdom of God,
I think
and
the
it got
wisdom was
used.
I think the wisdom was more like, the way a politician goes to their campaign
Yeah.
manager.
Exactly,
It
exactly.
may
So
be
they're
wise,
like,
but it's not smart
yeah,
though.
yeah, they're exactly. So they're like, okay, I'm not trying to go against God. It's not my intent. I'm just trying to make sure that my kingdom survives, right? It's not like I
Mm.
want to go against God. So it's like, okay, how do we make sure that this
Right,
kingdom?
but like,
So maybe, so like I said at the beginning, like the Torah and the Ark was a Judah. So maybe he didn't have the opportunity to write the Torah. Maybe he didn't have the opportunity to do that, and he just was like, hey, let's just do what we can. And sometimes intentions aren't enough, because if your
Oh yeah.
intentions don't align with what God wants for you, they're just not right, right? If you're like, hey, let me just kill somebody, like whatever reason, is like, yeah, but God didn't like that. No, you can't do that, right? Like, stop,
but
stop,
I
stop.
mean, I understand what you're saying, but he did everything differently and opposed to what the Torah establishes.
Yeah.
And if he really wanted to do something for God's will, the kingdom was divided, but he still had
Yeah.
access to go to Jerusalem.
I think
You
it
know,
started as being a noble thing, like Tito was saying, but then it now, like you're saying, Tito, it twisted into something where it, like he even made a holiday on a month of his own choosing.
yeah,
That's not something you
But
do because you want to honor God, because He tells you exactly when to honor Him. There you go. There it is.
and he switched everything around. So it's
I'm not
like,
saying, and I'm not saying he didn't. I'm not saying he wasn't wrong. I'm just trying to I'm just trying to give like a little bit of enlightenment when it means like, okay, let's see what his thought process was. And we're not saying he didn't do wrong. He definitely did wrong, and we're not
right,
justifying what he did. It's just like,
Well, it
okay,
again,
what might have led him to
it
that?
may have started good, but I think we
Yeah,
all can agree that it ended horribly.
But I mean,
yeah, just
it
like
does
Solomon.
show
Like he,
you it does show you his thought process. It shows you what he was thinking. He was thinking like,
Mm.
look, these people are going to go back every year, and then they're
Mhm.
like, you know what? Why don't we just go back and reunite? And he's like, if they do that, I lose all my stuff. I don't want that
right,
to
Mhm.
happen.
dude, if I am 100% honest, and it hadn't to do with God, like if it had nothing to do with God, right? And if suddenly, like, yeah, why are you paying taxes to the nation next to us? Like,
Mm.
stop it. Like, pay taxes to me and your kingdom so we can build on it, not the nation who's next to us. Like, when you think about it rationally without putting God into perspective, you're like, yeah, that kind of makes sense. But the thing is, yeah, but you have to keep God in perspective. You can't push him to the side. Like, he has to be the main part of your perspective as a king, just
right.
like Solomon.
And we see that like right after that, it was just a straight downfall. It was not until King Josiah came into the picture that we start seeing a somewhat of like a return, somewhat. And you see that even with King Josiah, they were even so excited because they found a Torah scroll. People didn't even know what the Torah
That's
was
gonna be
about
crazy.
at that
I mean, it's kind of
point.
like today.
Mm.
We all
Yeah,
got
like
excited. But moving on, because I think we talked a lot about
We did. I'm
Jeroboam.
sorry.
you're fine.
My fault. My fault. My bad.
but
No, it's
um, but let's go into like the two houses and what exactly happened with the two houses. Let's start with the house of Judah. You know,
right. That's my topic, the two houses.
so let's start with the house of Judah. Well, I mean, the house of Judah, they never really got dispersed. They were exiled. You know, if you read the Bible, they were exiles for not keeping the Shemitah, which is the
Mhm.
sabbatical year. When you read the Torah portion, I think it's yeah. I have Leviticus 25 3 to 7. I'm not gonna read it because it's really brief, but basically it details like, look, I think it was 7 years. Every 7 years,
You let the land rest.
you let the land rest. You didn't do any
Mhm.
work on it. 6 years, you work it. The seventh
Mhm.
one, you let it rest. You
Right.
don't you don't work the land. You just let it grow wild. You can just pick out the fruit
Mhm.
from it.
Right.
Nobody touches anything.
Yeah,
That was the law.
Isaiah 50 kind of speaks on that and on what their mentality was at the time.
Mm.
We can read that. We can read that afterwards if you want. If you can find the
Yeah,
verse, if you
I can just like cite the mentality behind it if it's okay, because I mean we don't really have to read it. It's just like Shemitah. One of the things that you had to do in that year was release your servants. Like you,
Mhm.
like if your servant was a Israelite, like you can keep them there. Like you had to give them freedom. And in the book of Isaiah is like, yeah, but you weren't doing that. Like you kept your servants working. You weren't giving them rest. You weren't like you were keeping the Shabbat. Like you were chilling. But the thing is, your servants weren't. So that means that you weren't. So it's like
by
you're,
releasing
yeah.
it, it could also mean depths. And if you think about it business wise, it's kind of hard to you know just forgive somebody's debts because that's money that you're losing. So that's why they didn't want to do that.
Which kind of like goes back to the same topic. It's like sometimes doing what God wants isn't what's easy. Like it
Yeah.
wasn't easy for Jeroboam. He had to do it. It wasn't easy for Solomon. He had to do it, but they didn't. And you had the same thing going year after year. Like people were like, yeah, but it's kind of difficult to keep the Torah sometimes, because we want riches, we want all these things. It's like God's like, yeah, but I mean, there are more important things other than just being filthy rich.
For what I understand, they never kept the sabbatical year. If I understand it correctly.
They didn't.
No, no.
And,
So like even like the moment he said to do it, they're like, that sounds really cool, but we can't do that.
That's gonna be a no from me, dog. I'm gonna keep playing this field.
But there was, I'm sorry, but there was a consequence that it says that if you did not keep the sabbatical year, and that's further down in chapter 26, 34 to 35, it says, then the land shall enjoy its Sabbath as long as it lies desolate, and you are in your enemy's land. And the land shall rest and enjoy its Sabbath as long as it lies desolate. It shall rest for the time it did not rest on your Sabbaths when you dwelt in it. And then when you go further on in the Bible, you see in 2 Chronicles 36, 20 to 21, it talks about Judah being exiled and how the land was able to rest. And if I'm correct, 70 years, and that's for each year they didn't keep the Shemitah.
Yeah, it was like 10 years for every year they didn't keep it or something like that. I believe it was that, yeah. That the exact time they didn't keep it is when they would actually do it.
It was the amount of time they didn't keep the Shemitah.
Every year they didn't keep it, that was the year they were exiled. So that means...
That's what it was. Thank you,
yeah.
But what you're going to say?
Go, no, you go.
No, I was going to say, like, what are you going to say?
It kind of moves a little. It moves us a little forward. I don't know if this necessarily will want. But I kind of wanted to point out that the consequences that Judah had weren't necessarily as severe as they should have been because of the promise to David. And it's very important to like hold that into perspective because God is a God of promises, and He said to David, you will have your kingdom, you will be the one who's reigning. Your generations after that will be reigning, and He promised that to David. And you have these two nations, both start walking away from God, right? Because we just heard Jeroboam and what he was doing. And the descendants of Solomon weren't very good until Josiah, as you guys mentioned. And even then, like after that, they weren't particularly great. And then you have Ezekiel who was good, and then again bad. And so they weren't necessarily all great, right? So you have these nations, and it's like, wait, why? Which is, I don't know if which it's gonna lead us to is the punishment that Israel got was very heavy in comparison to what Judah had, and I don't know, when are we gonna talk about that?
Right after Judah, we're close.
All right, so it's very specific. It's like Judah's punishment seems really light in comparison to what Israel had, which we're gonna lead into, and it's because of the promise. It's because of God being a God of promises, God being a God of keeping His word and being like, I said I was going to do that. I'm going to do it, but you suck. So here you go, right? and I think we're going to lead to that.
But yeah, it's like you said, that it does seem like Judah has a least harsh punishment, but if you try to see the difference between their sins, one is a big difference versus the other, because the other one, they just disobeyed that law. But when we start talking about Israel, because the problem about Israel is that they were committing idolatry. And for God, spiritually, that's like adultery, and that's a very shameful sin, So,
but then you have the verse in Jeremiah that said that they both committed idolatry.
Yeah. If you read Jeremiah, it's going to say that they ended up both doing the same thing, but it does point a difference between Judah, being that they came back, but they were not really there. Paraphrasing.
Here's the thing. Also, the main issue is in that chapter you have to recognize who the writer is talking to. Right? He's talking to the king, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. So he's trying to inform that the northern kingdom needs to come back and that God is willing to forgive you, even though you've done these things, even though He handed you a bill of divorce and you took it and walked away. He's willing to take you back, despite all of that. And the only reason why Judah was
Spoiler
there,
warning.
yeah, right. And the only reason why Judah is there is because of his promise to David, even though their crime may be as bad or in the chapter does say worse, but still, the point is.
But yeah, let's go into what the house of Israel did. It's covered in 2 Kings 17, verse 1 to 18. Let me see
I
that.
will keep speaking as you guys search for it.
I got it. I got it. I got it. Yeah. So okay.
You read
So
it. I'll be right back.
yeah. So it says, in the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hosea, the son of Elah, became king of Israel and Samaria. And he reigned 9 years, and he did evil in the sight of the Lord, but not as the king of Israel who were before him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against him, and Hosea became his vassal and paid him tribute money. And the king of Assyria uncovered a conspiracy by Hosea, for he had sent messengers to So, king of Egypt, and brought no tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore the king of Assyria shut him up and bound him in prison. Now the king of Assyria went throughout all the land and went up to Samaria and besieged it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away to Assyria, and placed them in Hala and by the harbor, the river of Gozan, and in the cities of Medes. For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh king of Egypt. And they had feared other gods, and had walked in the statutes of the nations whom the Lord has cast out from before the children of Israel, and of the kings of Israel, which they had made. Also the children of Israel secretly did against the Lord their God things that were not right, and they built for themselves high places in all their cities, from watchtower to fortified city. They set up for themselves sacred pillars and wooden images on every hill, high hill, and under every green tree. There they burned incense in all the high places, like the nations whom the Lord had carried away from them. And they did wicked things to provoke the Lord to anger, for they served idols of which the Lord had said to them, You shall not do this thing. Yet the Lord testified against Israel and against Judah by all of his prophets, every seer, saying, Turn from your evil ways and keep my commandments and my statutes according to all the law which I command your fathers, and which I sent to you by my servants and the prophets, my servants the prophets. Nevertheless, they would not hear, but stiffened their necks like the necks of their fathers, who did not believe in the Lord their God. And they rejected his statutes and his covenant that he had made with their fathers, and his testimonies which he had made against them. They followed idols, became idolaters, and went after the nations who were all around them, concerning whom the Lord had charged them that they should not do like them. So they left all the commandments of the Lord their God, made for themselves a molded image and 2 calves, made a wooden image, and worshipped all the host of heaven, and served Baal. And they caused their sons and daughters to pass through the fire, and practice witchcraft and soothsaying, and sold themselves to do evil in the sight of the Lord, to provoke him to anger. And therefore the Lord was very angry with Israel, and removed them from his sight. There was none left but the tribe of Judah alone. And that's pretty much, it covers the house of Israel.
Right. Yeah. They did a lot of things wrong. Like it's not just one thing, right? It's
I mean,
yeah.
it was like a descent.
So like yeah, like you said, yeah. It started with they're worshiping God. As I said, they had 2 golden calves, which at the point represented God, right? They're not worshiping other gods. Suddenly they started building wooden statues. Suddenly they started building. They started sending their children to fire, which is to Moloch, which God is don't do that, right? So they started slowly descending, and the last straw for God was, believe it or not, it's the breaking of the third commandment. The third commandment is don't use my name in vain. And when we make covenants, we represent God, right? And there's a we Rico's taught about this, Gable's taught about this, Walter's taught about this. Is we have this misunderstanding of what using the name of God in vain is. It's not necessarily saying God's name. That's not using its name in vain. It's you making a covenant, you making a pact, using his name. It's like, yeah, I make a covenant with you, Tito, and you know that my God is Yah. So you're like, yeah, you're holding Yah to this covenant.
It's a casual business.
Yeah. So suddenly you have So suddenly you have Hosea saying to the king of Assyria, being like, I'm gonna make a covenant with you. I'm gonna be your servant. I'm gonna work. Yeah, we're gonna work together. There's no issue. And suddenly he went behind Assyria's back, right? So he's like, in God's name, right? We still do this nowadays in court. You know, you put your hand on the Bible and you're like, I
Mhm.
swear that I will uphold to say only the truth and nothing but the truth. Same thing. That's a swear. That's using God's name as your representation to make sure that you're not lying. So suddenly Josiah starts lying and goes behind Assyria's back and goes to the kingdom of Egypt and be like, hey, can you help me take Assyria out, buddy? I would really appreciate that. And Assyria's like, what you doing, boy? What you like? What are you doing? So suddenly like everything started boiling over until the king did this, and God's like, no, that's enough. That's enough. Like I've let you have enough fun. I've let you do whatever you want, but now you're using my name and you're dragging I let you do what you want, but now you're dragging my name under the mud, and I will not allow that. And God said, nah, this is enough. It's enough. Tis be enough. Assyria, come over
But
and just
the
let him whoop some butt.
I think the root of the problem, where everything started, was Jeroboam tried to separate his kingdom from the temple of God. And it's kind of like today. You see, like I said, replacement theology. They try to separate, the Christians from the Jews, quote unquote. So they try to separate from the identity of Israel, and they try to make this new identity, and they try to do things their own way, and try to do their own spin-offs of what the prophecies mean and things like that. And they're doing the same mistakes that Jeroboam did, because they're taking what God intended and they're twisting it into something that it's not.
Exactly. They're trying
Exactly.
to
Thinking that
yeah
they're
they're
doing the right thing.
yeah, exactly. They're trying to usurp the authority of God and put their own in place.
Which they can't, because like I think we mentioned a couple times, like once God makes a covenant, it's forever. So you
Exactly.
can't just like be like, oh well, it's not really forever. It doesn't work
Right.
like that.
My
You
bad. I lost my iPhone.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
okay.
I was like,
That's, like, I don't understand
No,
what's
I have
happening.
no clue where it's
Yeah.
at. My bad, guys.
You
okay.
should.
But yeah, I think it's also you were reading also in that chapter in the beginning, and something that we've studied in ancient Near East, how the children of Israel were pretty much dispersed by the
Mhm.
Assyrians, and that just was it was an act of shame. So Israel was dispersed, and when it says this just dispersed by the Assyrians, it's not just dispersed by saying, oh, they were just removed. That carries the weight like they were shamed, and therefore they were dispersed to wherever they wanted to go.
I'm
You know we
sorry.
can't see you, right, Oscar? You know we can't
I
see
just
you.
He
I
heard
pinched
himself.
myself so bad, bro. Oh Jesus, man.
Oh God.
But anyway,
Oh my bad. Ouch.
I saw his face when he got pinched. Like
Oh no.
pure pain and agony came over his face.
Pure
All
agony.
right.
But as we go reading on in Jeremiah 3:8, you see that God mentions that He gave a certificate of divorce to Israel,
Mm-hmm.
and that's because, and when you read the Torah, it talks about when a woman commits adultery, the man, or let me find the verse. I think I put it. Deuteronomy 24:1-4.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you're talking about the loss of marriage.
Yeah, so I don't want to misquote myself or
Yeah,
the
no, that sounds
Bible.
about right. You can look it up directly, but that sounds about right.
Let's see.
It's just say don't quote me on this exactly, but just say it.
Yeah.
That's
Well, here
what I
let's.
do all
It's
the time
since it's like
whenever
yeah.
we're
Don't
doing
Well,
don't
since it's like
this.
4 verses, we could always
don't Facebook fact check me.
Yeah,
All right.
just Google
Chapter
it. Google
24,
it.
right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Just say
that's
Google it.
When a man takes a wife and marries her, and it happens that she loses his favor because he has found something indecent or unacceptable about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house. Essentially, what Adonai did to the northern kingdom. And after she leaves his house, she goes and becomes another man's wife. And if that latter husband turns against her and writes her a certificate of divorce, puts it in her hand, and sends her out of his house, or if the latter husband dies, who took her as his wife, then her former husband, who first sent her away, may not take her again as his wife, since she has been defiled. For that is an outrage before the Lord. You shall not bring sin on the land which the Lord your God gave you as an inheritance.
But let's focus for today. Let's focus for today on the first part, which says that if he finds something that is not right. And specifically, that could be defined as worshiping other idols.
Adultery. Yeah.
Go adultery, going against God, going against the law of God. If the wife does something of the manner, you have the opportunity to give a certificate of divorce so that
Mhm.
she may leave out. And that's what God did to Israel after Israel went as far as to use God's name in vain. God was like, I'm done with you. You have gone far enough. I am no longer going to be your husband. And what happened is that God's protection left Israel.
Mhm.
Like God said, you
Yeah.
know what? I'm not your husband. A husband protects his wife. He said, I'm not your husband anymore. I will not protect you. I will not fight for you. I will let all those who want to devour you as you are, because you are no longer mine. And it happened. Assyria came over Israel and devoured Israel as a whole. They were not ready for it. They could not handle it. And God was not with them at all. And
Right.
it's not that Assyria defeated God, because
No.
this same thing comes up later with Babylon. It's like God didn't listen. It's not that God was defeated, it's that God did not fight for you. He didn't fight for you anymore. And it happened, and they were destroyed and they were captured. And
Mhm.
so the story goes.
Yeah, but then that brings us to the big dilemma, the issue that we have is like, okay, so God divorced Israel, and we
Mhm.
just read that if a man divorces his wife and she gets married, and in this case, Israel, by committing idolatry,
Mhm.
they made like a covenant with other gods. So basically,
Mhm.
they marry themselves to those idols. So
But there's one part of that verse that also needs to be really focused on, and that is if the other husband leaves her or dies, then
Mhm.
the first husband cannot reclaim her again.
Yeah.
yeah, so now you're stuck at it like, okay, so when we read the prophecies, it says that the house of Israel is supposed to come back.
Hmm.
But what's
So
exactly so why does that necessarily become a dilemma? Let's explain it to them. Why is that necessarily a dilemma?
that's the cliffhanger, man. That's
That
for
yeah,
that's for
that's
that's for part
that
Oh,
two.
leads to
come
part two.
on. Jeez, man. I'm ready to
That's
go back.
the
I'm
good
ready
part.
to.
Well, if we got you, then we'll definitely get the audience. So there you go.
Yeah, definitely.
All
There you go.
right, all right,
But
all
yeah,
right, all right, all right.
the answer you will find in part two.
And
Yeah, I'll take a sponsor ad or two.
Will got to take them back. Find out next week on the Real
Yeah.
Dates podcast.
All right,
what will
so
God do?
but yeah, that's the big issue. Like he says he's gonna bring back Israel, but
Mhm.
according to the Torah, it's impossible. So how
Exactly.
do they
Yeah,
fix that?
because
Ooh.
later
Ooh.
prophecies, God. So to be specific, in the book of Hosea, right?
Don't
It's the book
don't
of.
don't spoil
Uh,
this. What are you doing?
I'm not spoiling. I'm not
No,
you are
spoiling. I'm not
no,
spoiling.
spoiling. You
You are
already said
no,
spoiling.
it. You already said it.
no,
You
no,
asked. Hey, let me finish.
no. I asked the
Let me
question.
just.
I didn't give an answer. Don't give an answer.
I'm not giving an answer. I'm not giving an answer. I'm not giving an answer. I'm not
Okay.
giving an answer. So
I don't believe you.
the no. So the dilemma comes from, right, because you have this verse in the Torah that says that they will not come
Hmm.
back, right? If you
Hmm.
Right.
marry,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
divorce, and then they marry and divorce, they can't come back to the first husband, right?
Exactly.
Or die.
That doesn't necessarily establish a dilemma, because God isn't taking them back, right? So I'm giving the verse that actually creates a dilemma in the book of Hosea. In the book of Hosea, he's speaking to the people of Israel, not Judah, Israel per se. And he says in the book of Hosea that they were gonna come back. And suddenly you have everybody going nuts. It's like, that's impossible, because of the verse that Rico just read, because
Mm.
they cannot come back. That's the dilemma. I just wanted to give a little context of the verse.
I
I'm
see.
not gonna
Okay,
go into
okay.
it. I'm not gonna go into it. I'm
Fancy
not gonna
man
go
over
into it.
here.
All right.
I'm just ratatouille, just like
Oh wow,
But
you
pulling some hairs. I'm just
got
pulling
them
some
chef's
hairs.
kiss Bible
yeah.
verses. Very nice.
But like I said, we'll explain it all in the second video. And for me, that's the best part. It gets juicier.
It is.
Yeah,
It is.
exactly.
It's so
Yeah,
juicy.
you should
It's so juicy. It's so
you should add
juicy.
a record skip at some point in the explanation. We'll find out next week.
Well,
Cut black. Fade.
so
Oh God.
I'll see you guys, and I will see everybody next week.
See you
All
next
right.
week,
See you
everybody.
guys next
See ya.
week.